Madam President, his name was George Floyd. 7 days ago, he was killed on the streets of Minneapolis. He was not the first African American to be the victim of racism and criminal misconduct by the police. It's happened in our history many times. But this was different. This was a killing which we watched in real time. In fewer than 9 minutes, a Minneapolis police officer with his knee on the neck of George Floyd took his life away. Despite Mr. Floyd's begging over and over again, his pleas that he couldn't breathe, even invoking the name of his mother, it didn't stop what happened. That photo is still emblazoned in my mind, as I'm sure it is for all of those who've seen it. The look in that policeman's eyes at the videotape that was being taken of that incident was cold and hard and distant, unmoved by George Floyd's plea and the plea of those around him. What a tragic moment for our country. What a tragic moment for that family. What does this say about who we are in the United States of America, that in the year 2020, this sort of thing can happen with such frequency? The heartbreaking killing of George Floyd follows years of similar tragedies and needless loss. In 2012, 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, shot and killed by a vigilante as he walked home with a bag of Skittles that he just bought from a local 7-Eleven. His crime? Black in America. In 2014, the words "I can't breathe" were seared into our minds when we saw the video of Eric Garner struggling for his life and dying as a police officer held him in a chokehold. His crime? Black in America. Weeks later, Michael Brown was shot and killed by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, despite being unarmed. A couple months later, on the streets of Chicago, Illinois, Laquan McDonald was shot and killed by a police officer. The next month after he was killed, Tamir Rice was shot and killed by a police officer while playing with a toy gun in a Cleveland park. The tragic list of black individuals we have mourned and marched for continues to grow. Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Philando Castile, Botham Jean, Auntiana Jefferson, many more, including Sandra Bland, another resident of Illinois, whose life was taken when she drove down to Texas to interview for a new job. I attended her funeral ceremony. The loss of such a wonderful young woman is still unexplained. Now we've come together to mourn the lives of 2 black men and a black woman, lives that were cut far too short in incidents of inexplicable and inexcusable violence. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. Once again, those gut-wrenching words, "I can't breathe," have brought us to tears. As activist Brittany Packett Cunningham has pointed out, justice for George, Breonna, and Ahmaud would mean that they would each still be alive and breathing today. What we must now seek is accountability. The arrest of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin is the first step in that direction. But there is so much more that must follow. Too often, police officers have crossed the line from lawful protection of our communities to baseless targeting, harming, and killing of unarmed Americans of color. Perhaps an arrest of the officer will be made, but our system of justice rarely leads to real consequences that follow. How many more names of black men, women, and children will be crying out in protest before America finally acknowledges the obvious. We cannot call ourselves a land of justice until we address those fundamental issues of racial injustice. That will require an honest, candid conversation with leaders in the law enforcement community about training, inherent bias, use of force, and the consequences for their unjust action. It will require prosecutors and courts to commit to pursuing true accountability when injustice occurs. And it will require legislators like myself, those I serve with in the Senate and in the House and in state legislatures around this country to continue to undo the damage of a criminal justice system fraught with racial disparities. Most importantly, it will require those of us with privilege and power to step back and listen to Black America as they tell us about what a life facing pervasive systemic racism is like. If we truly want to reach a new day in America, impacted communities must lead the conversation. Allies must play an active, supporting role in confronting and dismantling racism. We know there are several steps the federal government could take right now to begin the process of moving forward. A good place to start was President Barack Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. In 2015, President Obama's task force released a report outlining crucial reforms to strengthen community policing and restore trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Under President Obama's leadership, the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division investigated civil rights abuses in multiple police departments across the country: Baltimore, Ferguson, Missouri, Cleveland, and yes, Chicago, Illinois. Unfortunately, the current president dismantled these efforts as soon as he took control of the Department of Justice in 2017. In this heartbreaking moment of crisis, America is pleading with us for leadership. President Trump and Attorney General Barr could demonstrate that leadership by implementing the recommendations of the task force, the 21st Century Policing, and permitting the Civil Rights Division to do its job and vigorously investigate police departments accused of engaging in a pattern or practice of misconduct. We have a role to play here too. We must immediately hold hearings on systemic racism and police misconduct so that we can discuss and pursue solutions, including accountability and training. Chairman Graham of the Senate Judiciary Committee has announced the committee will hold a hearing on police misconduct. I'm glad that he made that statement. I hope it's more than just one token hearing. When I chaired the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Human Rights, I held several hearings on race in America, including my last hearing as chairman in December of 2014 on the state of civil and human rights in the United States. I said then, and I repeat it today, it is important to recognize and say clearly that there is still a problem with racism in America, and we still have so much more to do. We have got to acknowledge the obvious. As one sign said at a demonstration yesterday, all Black people are not criminals. All white people are not racist. All policemen are not bad. We have to find the problems and solve them, but we cannot ignore the obvious. Since the Republicans took Senate majority control in January 2015, the Senate Judiciary Committee rarely, if ever, addresses these issues of systemic racism in America. In fact, the last hearing on policing was almost 5 years ago. In November of 2015, the junior senator from Texas held a hearing entitled, quote, "The War on Police, How the Federal Government Undermines State and Local Law Enforcement." It was a thinly veiled attack on the efforts of the Obama administration's Civil Rights Division to improve police integrity. 4.5 years after that hearing, we still have so much work to do, and I'm committed to joining with my colleagues to listen to civil rights leaders, activists, and affected communities, and work with them to improve life in my state and across the nation. I hope we can honor George, Breonna, Ahmaud, and all of the black and brown lives that have been lost in brutal acts of racial injustice. We need to do this by reforming the system that has permitted these atrocities to occur and dedicate ourselves to bringing about justice and accountability. Madam President, it was many years ago when I was a law student in this city. The year was 1968. I remember it well. It was an historic year, and much of the history was painful. I was sitting in the student library at Georgetown Law School, and a professor opened the door and asked that all students in second and third year come out in the hallway. I went out in the hallway, and he said, "We need your help. As you know, the city of Washington is ablaze with demonstrations in anger over the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. The system of justice has broken down in the city. They've run out of attorneys to even stand with the accused defendants before the court. We are preparing to empower you, even as a law student, to walk across the street to the DC court and play that role. We need you." I did it, nervous as could be, uncertain of what I was actually doing, but realizing that the system of justice in this city had all but broken down. I think we've learned the hard way that to maintain order in a democracy, you need a consensus on what is the common good, and the belief that we all must stand together to make certain that it's protected. There will always be its enemies and outliers, but ultimately, if we are to move together as a democratic nation, we have to understand and work together toward the common good, a common goal. And shouldn't the beginning of that common good or common goal be the end of racism in America? I've read so much history about the Civil War and the role of another Illinoisan, Abraham Lincoln, in bringing that war to a successful conclusion, the constitutional amendments that followed, the promises that followed as we emancipated slaves across the United States. Those promises, sadly, were not kept. Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws, and the discrimination that followed is still with us today. There was one moment, one shining moment in my political life when I stood just a few feet away from a new president of the United States by the name of Barack Obama, an African American, and I thought to myself, finally, Durbin, maybe we've reached that turning point in America when it comes to race. If we can accept an African American as the leader of our nation, maybe, just maybe, we are moving toward the day we've all dreamed of. I'm afraid he moved us forward, but not far enough, and he would be the first to acknowledge. We have work to do. It used to be a bipartisan effort when it came to making certain that minorities, especially African Americans, were not denied the right to vote. That used to be bipartisan when I first came to Congress. Now it's become another sad, divisive, partisan issue. And the efforts to restore the Voting Rights Act failed because the Republicans no longer join the Democrats in that quest. There are so many other areas that lie ahead that we have to address beyond criminal justice. We have to address economic justice. We know from the COVID-19 pandemic that those who are minorities in this country, the black and brown, are dying at a much greater rate, a much higher rate than others. There are gross disparities, racial disparities, poverty disparities when it comes to healthcare in America. And the same is true for education and housing and so many other aspects of what being an American is all about. That agenda is before us. And if we think that coming to the floor and making a speech and having a hearing and moving on will solve the problem, it will not. It will not. We have to envision moving forward, rethinking America. And we have to acknowledge that the process will be far from perfect. Just the last 2 nights in the city of Chicago and across the United States, we have seen incidents occur which I thought I'd never see again. They hearken back to that 1968 reaction to the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. There are burnings, looting, confrontations, things that sadly look exactly like they did some 50 years ago. The reality is this: in America, we are given a constitutional right to express our feelings, our free speech, and our free assembly. And those rights are important and should be valued and respected. But those rights to march, to demonstrate, as people are doing right outside this building at this very moment, cannot be taken to the point where they've reached an extreme and become destructive. Speaking, assembling, exercising your constitutional right does not include looting. It doesn't include arson, vandalism, or violence. In fact, those actions detract from the underlying message which calls for positive change in America. I am glad that leaders like John Lewis, my dear friend and former colleague from the House of Representatives, has made that point. His voice on the subject is much more articulate and more convincing, but he's reminded us that if we are to move America to the place where it must be, then we must do it in a nonviolent fashion, within the law, not breaking the law. His name was George Floyd, a 46-year-old African-American. He died on the streets of Minneapolis with the knee of a police officer on his neck for almost 9 minutes. He cannot be forgotten, and all the others that I've mentioned must also be remembered. It is time for us, it is time for our generation to say enough. Madam President, I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of quorum.